All right, go.
Hello, welcome everyone to our Future Scientists webinar. Today we will have Professor Joyeeta Gupta talking about climate change, planetary boundaries, and the need for an environmentally just approach. And before I go ahead and introduce Professor Gupta and talk a little bit about what she will be presenting, I'd like to have a bit of a question that you can answer as an icebreaker. And here in the chat, you should have a link to a platform where you can answer the question, and that will also be where you can post questions after the presentation. So here the question is about what are your associations with the term climate justice? And while you're filling this in, I would also like to tell you that the presentation will be about half an hour, after which we'll have plenty of time for questions, for Q&A, using the same tool that you are also answering the question now. And so maybe a little bit about Professor Joyeeta Gupta. He's a professor of environment and development in the Global South at the Amsterdam Institute for Social Science Research of the University of Amsterdam, and also at the IHE Delft Institute for Water Education. She's also the principal investigator on the ERC Advanced Grant Project CLIF, Climate Change and Fossil Fuels. She's also the faculty professor on sustainability and leads the program group on governance and inclusive development. She's also the co-chair of the EARTH Commission that is set up by Future EARTH. Her presentation today will talk about the challenges in setting a planetary boundary for climate change and the way in which responsibilities for achieving this boundary can be defined or were defined, the challenges with respect to resource use and emerging challenges on stranded assets, and the challenges with adaptation. Also in her presentation, she'll argue that while governments have sought to address the problem of climate change using cost-effective, technological, and efficient market-based approaches, without an equitable approach, it's unlikely that the climate change problem will be addressed. So once again, welcome, and now I hand it over to Professor Gupta.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's really fascinating to see the kinds of terms you use when you talk about justice with respect to climate change. And I'm going to maybe start with the term taboo in scholarship. I remember when I was working on my PhD thesis on climate change in the early 1990s, the focus on justice and equity was seen as not really scientific. And there was also a lot of critique when I was talking about neo-colonial approaches to the way in which the climate change problem was being solved. So in fact, that taboo has taken almost 30 years to be broken. And now I come from a conference in Stockholm last week, which was Stockholm Plus 50. And everywhere I looked, people were talking about justice and inclusion and equity. That doesn't mean that governments are talking about it, but at least the social movements have really picked this topic up. And it is now much more legitimate in the last 5 years to talk about these issues. But let me start and link up my presentation to some of the things you've said while I'm doing my presentation. So basically, sorry, I went too fast. So basically, I'm going to be looking at climate change primarily, and I've been working on climate change for 30 years. And then I link a little bit with planetary boundaries and why we need a just approach. So if you look at any of the major environmental issues, whether it's climate, whether it's water, biodiversity, land use, essentially what we are seeing is that there is a limit to nature. This is also referred to as ecospace or environmental utilization space. And this space is shrinking every year in some cases. And the big question is, how are we going to share this space amongst different countries? Is it going to be the market that does the sharing, or will there be other ways of doing this sharing? So let me bring the same sort of sharing concept to climate change. For 30 years, we have been debating about what is the boundary when we talk about climate change. So in the beginning, in 1990, there was a discussion about a long-term objective, but that long-term objective was not quantified. And that was because countries were afraid to sort of set a boundary. And this went on for years. And finally, in 2015, the Paris Agreement agreed to a boundary of 2 degrees centigrade and possibly trying to reduce this boundary to 1.5. But the question is, are we not already seeing massive harm of populations worldwide at much less than 1.5 degrees centigrade? So, how are these boundaries set? For whom, why, and why is this boundary important? This boundary is important because you have to convert this degree centigrade into a sort of permissible carbon budget, and then you have to divide that carbon budget between countries. And this has been the reason why we've been negotiating for the last 30 years. Now, on the x-axis, you have time, and on the y-axis, you have greenhouse gas emissions. And basically, we have to get our greenhouse gas emissions to 0. Now, what we have seen is that if you go early in time, at that time, 30 years ago, it was still possible to increase our global greenhouse gas emissions. But as we move towards the period when we should reach 0, the cake shrinks annually. And this means that the conflict between countries, between rich and poor, between the North and the South is going to get much more difficult. And you can see that in the negotiations, because 30 years ago, we were willing to talk about saying that rich countries should reduce their emissions first, and then poor countries should do that. And today, since 2009, we've given up that concept. We're in a post-equity world where basically we're saying, okay, everyone does what they can. And that's not how you share a very tiny cake between countries and people. So if I go back again to 1990, at that time, we thought that there was an inverted U curve. So in the first graph, you see income per capita on the x-axis and emissions. And basically, the idea was that developing countries would slowly increase their emissions. At a certain point, their emissions would peak, and then it would start to come down. And industrialized countries were already on the right side of the peak. Now, this was based on our understanding of other environmental pollution, for example, local waste management, that after a while, when you get rich, you don't want to see the flies outside your house, so you're willing to pay a little bit more to have that waste picked up. So there would be an automatic reduction. And so in those days, the idea was that rich countries would provide technologies to the developing countries so that they could jump across. Rich countries would demonstrate their leadership by reducing their emissions, which they thought would be very easy because they were already on the right side of the curve. And the poor countries thought, this is great, we don't have to reduce emissions, we will get instead technology and money. And so that's why within 2 years, we get the Climate Change Convention. But much later, we discovered that this is not how it works on climate change. You cannot see greenhouse gases, you cannot breathe it, you cannot smell it. And so basically, there's no automatic incentive for people or countries to reduce their emissions. And so now what we need is different countries to find a different route to development to reduce their emissions. So let's talk about the sharing of the carbon budget cake. That's the first justice issue. So in 1992, we get the Climate Convention, and it basically says that rich countries should reduce their emissions in 2000 with respect to 1990. But what happened was that this target was in a legally binding document, but it was vaguely written. So the lawyers will tell you there is no target in the Climate Convention for rich countries. Between 2000 and 2008, we have no targets. Between 2008 and 2012, we get the Kyoto Protocol target kicking in. So the protocol was adopted in 1997, but the target kicks in 2008. And the idea was that rich countries would reduce their emissions by 5.2% with respect to 1990 levels. So it's quite modest, this target. But ultimately what happened was that the United States and Canada did not participate. So you have the whole of North America outside the system. And that sends a very negative message to the rest of the world. And then they were trying to have a follow-up target for the period 2012 to 2020. That was in the Doha Amendment. And the idea was that this would be a voluntary process, so countries would themselves agree to reduce their emissions. But what basically happened was that the United States, Canada, Russia, and Japan decided they were not going to participate. The amendment eventually came into force just before 2020, so it did not actually make an impact. I'm pretty sure that most of you have never heard of the Doha Amendment. And then you get the Paris Agreement in 2015 for the period 2020 to 2030. And now basically it's a target in a legally binding document, but every country basically voluntarily says what they will do. And so therefore we are in a post-equity period. And this voluntary target that everybody is trying to adopt doesn't add up to what we need to stay below 2 degrees, let alone to reach 1.5. And the philosophy of the rich countries in this last period was that, we can manage if we really encourage renewables and use market mechanisms. That was the philosophy. And basically, they did not have very clear downward targets as a group, and they didn't decide to phase out fossil fuel. And so they sent the wrong message to developing countries. And even today, European Union countries, the United States, Canada, and other places in the West are still trying to develop fossil fuels, new fossil fuels. And they all thought that if we encourage renewables, this will automatically replace fossil fuels. That's not the case. It just increases the demand of people, or it meets demand. And one of the reasons why the term fossil fuel was not even mentioned in the Paris Agreement, and why the phase out of fossil fuel has not been important all this time, is because the economy of the fossil fuel world is perhaps worth somewhere between $12 to $200 trillion. And when you compare that to global GDP, which is $86 trillion, you can see that this is a huge amount of money. And the people who have stakes in this economy are unlikely to want to change this. And I'm not just talking about the oil, coal, and gas companies. I'm talking about pension funds who have shares in these companies, or investing banks, or even the person on the street that needs to take their scooter or their car to the market to bring vegetables to sell. Even they are probably using fossil fuels. So it's very difficult for them to move. And at the same time, when you look at all the reports that have come out, they all focus on the subsidies, but the subsidies are quite small in comparison to the whole amount of the fossil economy. So phasing out fossil fuels is likely to be painful for everybody. For the poor, for the rich, maybe disproportionately more so for the poor because it becomes existential for them. But in terms of dollar value, it will be very high for the others. And so therefore, today we are in overshoot. And the only way we can reach a sort of a zero is if we talk about compensating for that overshoot by taking out carbon from the atmosphere. And that's why everybody is talking about net zero. But net zero is basically we emit and then we deduct things from it. But is this a way to continue emitting? And what are we deducting? Carbon capture and storage? Are we going to put it underneath the oceans? Are we going to put it into empty gas fields? Are we going to take land away from food production to grow biofuels? How are we going to do this? And what we have basically seen is that even though many of the scientific reports are talking about bioenergy and carbon capture and storage, there's not enough land and water for this. And it's extremely risky, and it's an underdeveloped idea. And it just enables companies and countries to find an excuse for saying, oh, we're going to do very well. We can do net zero. And I'm a bit afraid that this is just greenwashing. So the first conflict is that we did not divide the permissible amount of CO2 emissions. That's a justice question that was not on your list. The second justice question is that we have actually too much of fossil fuels available. About more than 80% of what we have cannot be used if we want to achieve the 1.5 to 2 degree target. Now, the question, the conflict here is who is allowed to use the remaining fossil fuels. So we are now talking about stranding a resource, so not using a resource that a country has. And of course, because this is worth so much money, many large actors are operating in the background. These are the fossil fuel firms whose global worth is perhaps more than 300 trillion. It's the pension funds who have massive assets in the fossil fuel arena, and they actually manage together 51% of the 2019 global GDP. We're talking about philanthropic organizations who also invest in fossil fuels and debt finances. And we're really talking about these massive actors on the one hand. And on the other hand, the big justice issue is that more than 82% of the remaining fossil fuel is in the developing world. So if we now want to phase out fossil fuel, basically we're telling developing countries you cannot use the fossil fuel that is in your country. However, these countries think, hey, we can now become rich, just like the OPEC countries became rich, just like the West became rich. So they feel that this is going to make their GDP go up. And besides, this will be one way for them to address energy poverty. So when you want to ask them to phase out fossil fuel use, this may not work. In fact, in 2015, most countries in the world agreed in the 2030 agenda that they were going for full permanent sovereignty, which means they can do what they like with the resources within their land. So the issue is now who is going to be allowed to use it. And basically, rich countries have used up massive amounts of fossil fuel. And it's not as if the war on Ukraine is going to actually massively lead to a shift to renewables. We're already seeing that everybody's trying to find additional sources of fossil fuel for the rich countries. So this is the second problem, that of sharing the resource of fossil fuel. The third problem is the fossil fuel asset problem. So I'm not talking about now the coal that's underground or the gas that's underground, but I'm talking about the infrastructure that we set up to take the coal out, take the gas and oil out, and the infrastructure to put it into a pipe, to bring it to various places, to transfer it in trains, the infrastructure to use that in your house for your heating or for your cooking or whatever. Now, what we are seeing is that rich countries continue to invest directly or indirectly in fossil fuel infrastructure in developing countries. I will show you some numbers in the next slide. Moreover, northern companies continue to invest in the South on fossil fuel assets. Thirdly, shareholders of assets in the global South are often from the global North. So right now they are making profits from fossil fuels in the global South, but they're coming from the global North. And finally, we see this massive divestment movement. But if I sell my shares, I'm selling it to somebody else. And so I create a new vested interest. And the big fear I have is that through these different ways, the global North is ensuring in some ways that the South either gets locked into a new fossil fuel infrastructure, or if they do not get locked in or want to stop the lock-in, they have to pay massive amounts of money back to northern actors in debt or interest on debt. So, for example, in a paper that we submitted, Arthur Rempel and myself, and it is now in review, we look at public financial support for African fossil fuel projects. And we see that prior to the Paris Agreement, $106 billion was spent through public finance on fossil fuel. And after the Paris Agreement, in a relatively shorter period, $42 billion was spent on fossil fuel. So this shows that they're still investing in developing countries. And many of them have already announced, the governments at least, that they will not do so, but they have not actually stopped investing in fossil fuel in developing countries. This is another slide from Arthur Rempel, who's just submitted his PhD thesis. And in his thesis, he shows that, in fact, if you look at Africa, there are lots of fossil fuel projects, but the headquarters of the firms that invest in these projects are mostly in other parts of the world, mostly in the global north, but you also see that there is some in China and in Brazil. And so basically, these shareholders are now making money from fossil fuel exploitation. And remember that if a developing country starts to invest in fossil fuel today or yesterday or tomorrow, they will not stop immediately, because the investment will be for 20 years, 50 years, 80 years, depending on the kind of infrastructure that they invest in. But the later you start to reduce your emissions, the sharper the curve has to be. So it's not like they can gently phase out. They will have to do it overnight, practically, if they want to achieve the 1.5-degree goal. And so this is going to be a big challenge for them, because they will get locked in and they will not be able to get out easily. Now, litigation is one way in which justice issues can be addressed. And what we're seeing worldwide is that social movements are both standing on the street, but they're also using the courts to shut down fossil fuel enterprises. And they're fairly successful in many parts of the world in doing so. So this is a good sign of the process of using the courts to undertake measures. But justice seems to cut in both directions, because fossil fuel companies who have contracts with governments or permits from governments, they are now suing governments for compensation for phasing out fossil fuel. So right now, within the European Union, the amount of money these companies are asking from governments to phase out fossil fuel is almost equivalent to the amount of money Africa needs to address energy poverty. So essentially what is happening is that the companies are asking governments to give them compensation for the loss of revenue if they close down a fossil fuel plant, which is actually completely the opposite of what should be happening, which is asking the companies to pay compensation for everything that went wrong. So essentially, most of you, when you talked about justice issues, you were really focusing on adaptation issues. You were talking about the money that the global south needs, and it was about the impacts. So you're talking about my fourth bullet, which I have actually not discussed here, because for me, mitigation is the number one adaptation option. If we don't mitigate adequately, adaptation will continue on for the next thousands of years. And of course, no Western government is going to commit to paying for adaptation for thousands of years. So that's one big justice issue, but I've just talked about three different justice issues: the sharing of emission rights, which did not happen so far, the sharing of who's allowed to use their natural resources, and we are now saying to the South they must not use their resources, the problem of our assets in the global north. So we're transferring our assets from the global north to the global south, our knowledge, our infrastructure, our shares, and we're going to leave them with the bubble when it bursts. So basically, there are many, many more justice issues involved than the ones that you put on the table. So climate change is not the only issue which is being discussed in terms of planetary boundaries. We're looking at biodiversity, nutrients, that's nitrogen and phosphorus, which is essential for food production, water. And the big question is, how will we share this reduced space over time between countries and people? And if you look at the justice narrative, what you basically see is on the left side and the x-axis, privileged people, and on the right side you see marginalized people. And what we're trying to show here is who is most affected in terms of vulnerability to risks and impacts. And there you see whether we are talking about air pollution or land degradation or climate change, it's essentially the marginalized on the right that are going to be worse affected. But if you look at who is causing the problem, then you will probably find that in terms of our investments, our production and consumption patterns, the rich are emitting the greatest amount of pollutants. And we are, our footprint in rich countries is 6 times our share of biocapacity, whereas the low-income countries, they use barely half their biocapacity. So basically, you see that those who are causing the problem, rich people and rich countries, So rich people also in poor countries, and those who are affected, they're totally different groups of people. And that's why it's so difficult to mobilize politics to think in terms of solving the problem. And this basically is one of the key reasons why the politics of deciding how to address climate change has been problematic. Now, one can also look at justice slightly differently. We could look at it in terms of access. So, millions of people to billions, so 3.2 billion people are facing problems because of degraded soils. Um, Billions are also affected by not having good access to sanitation services, whereas millions are affected every year through poor air quality, poor water quality, etc. So the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, they prioritize access to such resources. And I have 2 points to make here. The first point is, one second. If the resources are scarce, then the prices will go up. And that makes it then unaffordable for poor people. In fact, poor people may be even inclined to sell, sorry, to sell their lands to others. At the same time, if the government is subsidizing, this is a problem because the government has to increase its subsidies. So this makes access quite difficult to achieve. I'm going to lose my voice, I think, sorry. The other problem is, let's take climate change. If we want to meet access needs of people in an unequal world, we are likely to cross the planetary boundaries. And so therefore, we have to somehow redesign the way we allocate resources. That's the first part on access. Let's look at allocation. When we're talking about how resources are allocated or distributed, the Western world has tried to focus on markets. But if the market allocates a scarce resource, then only the rich can afford those resources and not the poor. Moreover, markets do not internalize the environment or social issues. And market mechanisms have not been very successful so far, at least on climate change. And who is participating in the market? A lot of companies. And these companies prioritize profits. Of course, they're talking about corporate social responsibility and socially responsible investment, but we see that these are having relatively limited impact. And of course, we want technologies to solve all these problems, but technologies are often protected by intellectual property rights. But even if you construct a dam, for example, those who manage the dam or own the dam, they then decide who's going to get access to water and under what conditions. So my feeling is that if we leave everything to markets and technologies and public-private partnerships, it will be very difficult to induce poorer countries and poorer people not to use the resources in their own countries. And I can give you 2 examples. How do we stop a country from taking out their fossil fuel? It's going to be very difficult. And if that is the case, then we cannot address a global environmental problem without a just approach. And I'm not sure if it is already too late to try a just approach, but I think we really need to invest in creating trust between rich and poor people, rich and poor countries. So to conclude, 10 years ago, and I come back to one of the things that you had mentioned about taboo on your slide, 10 years ago, scholars were saying separate out environmental issues from social issues, environmental issues from justice issues. They said, let's just get the environmental issues under control. And they wanted to focus on market mechanisms as opposed to targets and timetables. But 30 years into the process, we have found that if you don't have proper targets and timetables, you're not going to achieve these goals. The market mechanisms are not delivering. And in fact, these environmental and justice issues are so interlinked that it's not possible. Moreover, without focusing on fossil fuels, we cannot address climate change. Just focusing on renewables will not do the trick. And we cannot induce developing countries to phase out their fossil fuels. And Europeans and Americans think they can impose border tax controls that will prevent developing countries from exporting products made with fossil fuels, or it will make it more difficult for them. But I don't think that will be enough, because there are 150 developing countries. They will trade with each other. Industrialized countries have dragged their feet in addressing the climate problem, but also other problems. And this has exacerbated all the existing justice problems. So, in my view, without a just approach, there may be no way to address climate change or, in fact, any other environmental problem. I leave it here.
Okay, I think we can go straight into the questions. Well, thank you, Joyeeta. It was, as always, you've given us a lot to think about, and a very interesting, and I would say inspiring in some ways, conversation already. We have a list of questions already that I will get started with, but I believe people can continue to send them in as we talk more. But I would like to go back to this, what you've mentioned about justice being a bit of a taboo subject. And so you started your talk saying that climate negotiations, you see them at a post-equity stage in terms of how the negotiations are going on between countries. But that's happening sort of at the time when there's increasing attention to climate justice, maybe from other actors, but it's also justice is mentioned in the Paris Agreement and these kind of documents. So I'm wondering where you see most of the calls for climate justice actually coming from, and how do you see opportunities for those who are talking about climate justice to influence those who are maybe ignoring this kind of equity conversation? And then slightly related, do you worry about the justice conversation becoming sort of a form of, you could say, greenwashing from policymakers who are perhaps not putting that into place?
So it's a big question, but I think right from the start, and in fact, if I go back to 1989, small island states and other countries were right from the start talking about equity issues. And the Center for Science and Environment in New Delhi brought up equity and justice issues in the beginning. It just did not get the kind of traction that it needed to mobilize action. But at that time, still people were willing to talk about how to divide the cake. And so they said basically that rich countries should reduce their emissions first, and then poor countries can do their part. And the idea was the rich countries would provide technologies to the South. So there was some degree of a willingness to see that there's a difference between rich and poor countries in the climate change treaty and in the Kyoto Protocol. Having said that, I also mentioned that the climate treaty target was never seen as legally binding because of the indeterminate language which was used to express it, and the target in the Kyoto Protocol was ultimately was never accepted by the United States, and ultimately Canada withdrew. So basically what you're seeing is that they were very aware already that there's a justice issue involved in rich countries taking action quickly, and they were not so keen to take action themselves. So as a consequence of that the justice issue has always been there on the table of the negotiations, but IPCC and the scientists did not give as much attention to justice. There were sometimes discussions on equity, but they were not integrated into all the chapters. They were sort of an independent chapter on equity issues. And I think that's been a real problem, because if the scientists and the way in which they are represented in these assessments does not capture the message that without a just approach, we can't get there. The message that we were getting all along was, oh, technology will solve it and market mechanisms. So that was sort of the message. And there was an underlying emphasis on justice, not much. The social movements have picked up a lot in the last, I think, 5-6 years. There were pockets of NGOs all along that have worked on justice issues, but the traction that has been happening right now has never been there before. And I think they're also reacting to the fact that the Paris Agreement did not actually divide the cake. And in fact, the Paris Agreement asks each country to explain upfront how fair their policies are. What we see is that their policies are, each country is claiming that their policies are fair. So they're all giving different reasons, but that can't be. I mean, you can't just say that everybody says we are fair and therefore this is what we're going to do. And that's what I meant when I said it's a post-equity phase. This term does not come from me, it's from the scholarship. And that's where we are. But I think the social movements have to really pick up steam. But don't forget the multinationals will fight back, and that's why they're going to court also, and they're trying to get compensation.
Great. While we're on this topic, there's a question from somebody asking how you think issues of climate justice, specifically on mitigation, could be better implemented into scenario work or the integrated assessment models from the IPCC.
So the thing is that the scenarios that IPCC have used, they have certain inbuilt assumptions in their models. And those inbuilt assumptions are with respect to, for example, GDP growth or population growth, how technology will develop, the possibility of carbon capture and storage becoming more popular, but they had never really integrated justice issues into their narrative. They have had different stories in which they're trying to bring some justice issues, but it's not like they have actually questioned, for example, the concept of GDP and whether GDP is taking into account the internalization of the environment and the internalization of social issues. They don't do that well. So the scenario, and I also heard a very interesting story a week ago, which is that in some of the scenarios, people have assumed that if you optimize the costs in the model, then the results will be fair. And so they came up with that coal must be phased out from a cost optimization perspective, but they didn't look at the geography of where is coal distributed, where is oil distributed, where is gas distributed, and therefore what does it mean for countries. So those kinds of issues were not taken into account. And I think this is something that we really have to look at. But maybe we have to do some research on that further.
Yeah, I think it will require a lot of attention from a lot of different disciplines, which brings us to another question. And you also have a lot of experience working with interdisciplinary focuses on climate issues. And I think there's a range of people in the audience from different scientific backgrounds. So some people are asking from a natural science perspective or other perspectives, how can they introduce social and justice issues into their work, given that many of within those disciplines, there's issues of being considered being too political or not scientific enough if they're focusing on justice issues. How would you recommend that they take those on?
So I think the first point to make is that almost everything is a social construct. And so therefore, any choice anyone makes implicitly hides an assumption that people are making. So if you focus just on, say, developing a technology to solve a particular problem, you're already making the assumption that technologies can solve problems and they will not exacerbate other problems. So that is one thing to keep in mind. So everybody needs to know that their own discipline always has assumptions like we have. The second point is that if you look at assessments essentially look at the breadth of scholarship and they try to summarize what that scholarship says. Now, there is a nascent scholarship emerging about global justice issues. There's also a massive amount of scholarship on local justice issues, but there's a nascent scholarship emerging. And they could also just simply refer to these documents to say what is the state of current knowledge with respect to justice. Justice is not purely subjective. Justice gets institutionalized over time. So it's important to realize that, for example, let's take criminal justice systems. If somebody kills somebody else, that's murder, and all of us have internalized it overall in the world, and therefore we all see murder as a crime. That's a justice issue. So why is it so difficult for us to say that if somebody cannot access enough food, or energy to survive, that also is, in a way, an indirect, um, I hesitate to use the word murder, but an indirect problem. And now we are seeing a whole justice community coming up with ecocide. And there was a very strong movement on that, and they are trying to promote a global agreement on ecocide, which is sort of damage to nature. So I think it's not so straightforward that everything that social scientists do is not scientific, in the sense that it is all normative. And of course it's normative, but everything the natural scientists do is also normative. It's also based on some kind of assumptions. So I don't know whether that helps answer, but I'm happy to work with anybody who wants to take on justice on board.
Well, besides just the sort of general climate justice approach, is there any specific areas that you would wish to see natural sciences or economics or other fields paying more attention to in this area?
So let's just take climate change. Yes? We were talking in the beginning about 2 degrees centigrade, but we already know that at 1.1, we are hitting really high temperatures. We are having extreme weather events, and rainfall patterns are changing. So why don't we have enough science from the natural scientists telling us what is the damage that's happening today? A lot of the science that we are seeing is about 2100. But in fact, there's already data today that we could perhaps link up and make a stronger case. We're trying to do that in the Earth Commission, but when we sort of screen the literature to find materials, it's all about the future. But what about the present generation? So, a lot of the times we sort of accept that people are dying from air pollution. We accept that people are dying from water, lack of access to water, instead of saying, from a natural science perspective too, that this is not acceptable. What is the acceptable rate of death or displacement from an environmental issue? Now, that might be a political question, but we could get data from the natural scientists about, if the temperature goes up so much, they can't produce this crop, so people will be displaced because they can't live there. So that kind of data, even for today, would be very useful for us in the social sciences to take a step further, to draw lines about what is perhaps significant harm to people and what is less than significant harm.
Yeah, that's a really good point. There's a few questions about asking what you think about sort of specific interventions. So I'll just try to group these together a bit. So one person has asked how you think degrowth could work as a perspective to consider in climate justice issues. Another has asked about the concept of cancellation of debt. So cancellation of, for example, IMF debt for the Global South, and whether this could be an important way to help the Global South leave more fossil fuels underground. Well, we'll start with those two.
Okay, so let's talk about degrowth. I think the philosophy of and the content of degrowth is extremely valuable and very useful. I think the term degrowth just puts politicians off. I mentioned it a few years ago when I was chairing the Global Environment Outlook to our scientific steering committee. And I said dematerialization, decarbonization, deconsumerism, and degrowth. And I was just immediately told if I was going to start on the degrowth route, then that country would walk out. So it was very clear, that message. So I think the terminology of degrowth is not understood by policymakers because they're not reading the scholarship. They just hear the word degrowth and they think, oh my God, they're basically asking us to shrink. This doesn't sell to rich countries. It doesn't sell to poor countries. But if you are saying GDP, is GDP a useful concept? I must tell you that I was impressed last week in Sweden when the Secretary General of the United Nations said GDP is no longer a useful indicator. And that means this has moved from the margins to the mainstream. It's now right there with the Secretary General. It doesn't still, governments will accept it, but still you can see then that there is a rejection of the idea of GDP as an indicator of well-being in society. So degrowth will work as a concept as in terms of content, but maybe not as a political term. But I think the bigger problem we have is we know where we are today, but we don't know how to get to a future that perhaps is signified by degrowth or Ubuntu or bienvenue or whatever it is we want to call it. So some people talk about shrinking certain sectors and expanding certain sectors. But if you shrink the sectors today that bring in money and taxes, then automatically all the other sectors will shrink, because then there'll be no money for public education or public health or roads. So it's not so straightforward how you do your shrinking and your growing. You really have to have a new system, and we have no clear roadmaps on how to get from A to B. And that's one of the biggest problems we have today. Talking about cancellation of debt, I've been hearing about that since the debt crisis of the 1980s. And generally what happens is people get a new loan to pay off the old loan, and then they have to pay back the new loan. Sometimes there's a debt for nature swap. So what happens is that suppose a developing country has to pay in soft currency, in hard currency, but doesn't have the hard currency. Then, so suppose it has to pay $100. It has $100, but in local currency, but not in dollars. So what happens then is a Western NGO might pay the Western bank, say $80. So they pay not the full amount, but a little less. And they ask the government in the developing country to spend $100 in local currency to protect nature. So they buy $100 worth with $80, and they have paid off the debt. So that's how it works. But that led to all kinds of other problems. It led to inflation in these countries. There were other kinds of problems. I'm sure it can be managed and it can be done. And we could try to look for a debt for climate change swap and things like that. But you really have to make this instrument really work, and you have to understand it in its totality before you sort of go for it, because it doesn't always work the way you think it might work.
We have a few questions regarding specifics in the global south and a bit the sort of north-south dynamics. So one person's asked about what you think about domestic climate justice issues. And they've pointed out the fact that many richer countries can't even manage to address these countries within their own societies, let alone be able to address these effectively in the global south. And a second person's asked about what you think about decolonization with respect to climate, and whether they've pointed out the energy systems in global south may still operate under colonial structures, and what you think the role then for decolonization would be.
So let's just talk about the domestic climate justice issues. The domestic climate justice issues operate in every single country in the world today. So it's definitely there in unequal societies, whether we're talking about Brazil or India or South Africa. So you will see that some people benefit significantly and others are really exposed to the problems. So there is an inequality in the global south. But one of the things that many people from the global south don't realize is the inequality, for example, in the United States or in Europe. And this inequality is to some extent increasing in some parts of the world because of the growing neoliberalization in these parts of the world. And so therefore, we have to address these justice issues as well. So that's why in my story, it was rich, poor, and north-south. It's a combination, and you have to try to address them all simultaneously, or we're not going to be able to find a way out of this mess. It might be, in fact, in some ways also very difficult to do in rich countries. It's not as if the rich countries are better equipped to deal with the changing of the structure in their societies. They have other political challenges. Talking about decolonization, I mean, in my presentation, I didn't really talk about colonization, but I talked about the fact that rich countries are selling their knowledge and public funds in developing countries. Their rich companies are selling their shares to developing country actors. This is in a way a process also of colonization. Sometimes when you use the word decolonization, you may mystify the story. And I would say demystify the story, show very clearly what the injustice is and how we can try to prevent that. But I think the problem with climate change is we just have less than 8 years to get to 1.5, if at all it's possible to get to that level and not go beyond. So it's going to be quite a challenge to do that in a just manner from local to global, and the mind boggles. But on the other hand, I will repeat what a professor of mine said to me when I finished my thesis in 1997. He was from Bangladesh, and I was defending my thesis in the Netherlands. And he said, because I said to him, I didn't see a solution in 1997, so a long time ago, to the equity problems. And he said to me that when he was growing up, he didn't think colonialism would end. And one morning, it had ended. And it happened so rapidly and so fast, he was shocked. And when I look at the fall of the Berlin Wall, that happened also so rapidly and so incredibly fast. And we raised money like crazy for COVID in the West. Maybe we can do it, but we all need to get our acts together to get this to happen.
Got it. In terms of solutions, some of the sort of movements you see working on climate issues. So like you mentioned, like the litigation against companies or movements against certain investors to try to pressure them to reduce their fossil fuel exposure. How do you think we can implement measures that can prevent companies from then just trying to escape those problems? So prevent companies from then just moving their headquarters to another country, transferring all their assets to a tax haven, or selling off their oil to a different
Very
place.
difficult.
Yeah.
It's extremely difficult. And we're seeing also companies split up into bits and pieces where they're trying to get rid of certain more non-profitable ones. And so you can see a large company is visible, but when it gets sold off to small companies, it becomes invisible and it becomes more difficult to tackle. Companies by their very nature are very, very mobile, relatively. I mean, they can move their assets, they can move their headquarters, they can move their envelope headquarters, so they can have a fake headquarters somewhere. It's extremely difficult to address that problem. And I remember watching the Union Carbide case, which was the Bhopal case. I think it was 1984, and it was incredible how the company was able to maneuver from India to the US and then back to India, and move its assets out, deny that methyl isocyanide can become cyanide, etc. So the companies have so many resources at their disposal that they have probably all kinds of routes, and there is very little that we can do against these companies unless we have a global rule-making system that is universal. And that's one of the problems with our structure, because our structure is not focusing on targets and timetables. Our structure is not focusing on trying to come up with a universal norm that we can hold companies to. And companies themselves have been avoiding a code of conduct from the United Nations, or a code of conduct that can become a hard binding code of conduct. They always want to do a voluntary code, and that's really difficult. So I really don't know. But when I was studying law in the States, we were studying the United Nations. It was a code of conduct for transnational corporations, which never came into effect.
Okay,
that's 30 years ago, 33 years ago.
I would say we have time for maybe one or two more. One person would like to know if you think the Global South should be spending more attention on adaptation, probably given the progress of the climate situation in certain countries.
So the thing is with, for example, there was this National Adaptation Plan of Action, and we sent a student to Nepal to study what was being done. And she came to a village which didn't have drinking water. So, where do you start with adaptation when the city? So eventually the Adaptation Plan of Action focused on providing people drinking water in that village instead of actually adapting. So my feeling is that governments really need to start thinking about what is the development story they want, and then see whether mitigation and adaptation can be merged into it, but also biodiversity loss, also water, managing within the water resources that they have. I don't think they should just sort of say, let's put more money on adaptation. That would not work. For me right now, it's really like, where do I want to go? How do I get to this to this future with the population I have, the resources I have, and not risk the future lives of my people. And not to start thinking, how can I become like New York? Because if everybody wants to become like New York, then we're not going to solve the problem.
Yeah, got it. Integrating all these questions. Yeah. Okay. And I think a nice final question is how do we as scientists best contribute to the social struggle to avoid the worst of climate change and promote climate justice? What do you see as the most impactful actions we can take?
As scientists?
As scientists.
So it depends on the nature of the scientist. So if you're a natural scientist, it would be very useful if you could help provide some of the evidence social scientists need to be able to make some of their narratives. But also, I think that social scientists need to get quantitative evidence to support their narratives. So, for example, last week I heard that even fossil fuel plants that are being invested in South Asia and Southeast Asia is already leading to a debt problem in the global South. And I asked the person, do you have evidence? And she said, yeah, we are collecting that, but they don't really have that yet. And we do need to collect all these bits of evidence and bring them out into the open, because for a very long time, we didn't even know that the governments in the Western world were actually investing in fossil fuels in developing countries, because it was not there in the open. And in Germany, there was a court case under the Freedom of Information Act to get that kind of information out. I think in the United States, there was a request that all investments made abroad should be subject to environment impact assessment. So, there have been court cases happening over the last 10 years that have tried to create more transparency on what is actually happening in some of these issues which were not being covered. And if you don't get, and generally speaking, when social scientists have to write project proposals, they have to write project proposals that are theoretically innovative and brilliant. And if you just simply say, I want to do a research on why do national parks work or don't work, it's not innovative. It's not brilliant, but actually it's very useful knowledge. Why are the parks working and why are they not working? It's such useful knowledge, but for some reason, it will never get through the criteria for approval of these kinds of projects. And so I think that also change the way in which our projects are evaluated. It doesn't always have to be innovative. It has to be solid, and we have to get back the evidence we need to make the justice claims that we have to, that are necessary to make.
And do you think scientists should be trying to get their information to a particular
Yes.
party?
Yes, I think it becomes science should not be spectator sport. It's not like I'm writing about something and I don't care about whether people know about what I'm writing. So it's really important that we're able to communicate what we're doing. And of course, in that process, there is a compromise, because you're talking to other parties and you need to talk their language. So for example, when I say I don't like to use the term degrowth myself, if I'm in particular, I have tried it and I failed. So now I'm going to talk about development, but then I try to change the content of development. So, you use their language, but you try to change the content. And it's because if you don't try to, you don't want to frighten off the other side, but you really want to get it onto their agenda. And last year, we did a presentation at the World Bank and the Global Environment Facility as part of a UNEP process. And there we were talking about the problem with GDP. And this time, people were willing to hear us out. Whereas a few years ago, when we talked about, people weren't willing. But we've also changed the way to sell the story. So you also need to sell the story effectively. And that's something scientists must do, at least environmental and social scientists.
Yeah, I think that's a great note to end on. Thank you so much, Joyeeta, for the talk and for answering all the questions. Thank you to the audience for all your great questions. And yeah, nice to.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you all.
Yes, I'd like to also say thank you to everyone joining. And of course, thank you to Joyeeta, our speaker, for a very interesting presentation and a very interesting discussion. And we will be back with our webinar series after the summer. We hope you join us then as well. Thank you and have a nice afternoon and evening. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.